Thank you, Pastor Lewis. For those of you, and there are many of you I have yet to meet, I look forward to getting to know you better. For those of you who have forgotten who I am, my name is Jeff, and I have the great privilege of being one of the pastors here. And this is my first Sunday back after a 4-month sabbatical. I want to say just how good it is to be here with you all. I missed you all so very much. I think the time away reminded me of just how blessed I am to pastor this church. And I knew I was in trouble when on the second Sunday of my sabbatical back in May, I told Helen, oh my gosh, I already miss New Life. So you can imagine how much I miss you now. Someone advised me that for your sabbatical report, don't tell the congregation what you did, rather tell them what you learned. And so I'm going to spare you the misery of going slide after slide of all the different places we visited, activities we did, and food we ate. Instead, for the next 15 minutes, I want to share with you what God taught me during these past 4 months. Now, there's no way I can address everything God taught me. And so I'm just going to focus on 2 major themes. First, God helped me to understand how much of a mess I really am. How much of a mess I really am. You see, the time off helped me realize just how much of my identity is wrapped into my ministry. It helped me to realize just how much I confuse and conflate my relationship with God with my relationship to the church. I know this because during the sabbatical, I found myself restless. I found myself a little bit depressed. I realized how much of my significance and standing is determined by you all here, by your response, by the help of this ministry. And that's not healthy. And my sabbatical coach challenged me, saying, Jeff, I want you to discover who you are, not as pastor, preacher, counselor, or leader. I want you to know who you are simply as my child. I want you to read the Bible, not thinking, oh, this would preach well. I want you to watch a movie, not thinking, oh, this would be a great illustration. I want you to just spend time with me as my child. And I must say, it wasn't easy. After an hour or 2 of reading his word and praying, I get bored. I'm like, all right, what next? But thankfully, the Lord gave me creative outlets to commune with him on a deeper level. He enabled me to rediscover the joy of journaling. And so I found myself writing throughout the day, and through journaling, able to distill my thoughts more, understand my observations and perceptions, listen to the narratives that are going on in my heart, and really see what God is doing in my life on a day-to-day, moment-to-moment basis. I also was able to hike all over Orange County. And through these hikes, these 3-4 hour hikes, I would spend praying with the Lord. And thankfully, it's still okay to wear a mask outside so I can pray out loud and no one thinks I'm crazy, right? But through those moments, able to really lean in to my communion with the Lord. And I must say that as God detangled my identity apart from my ministry, and as I learned to wrap my identity around God's presence and pleasure, I found my life that much more liberating, calming, peaceful, and satisfying. As I mentioned, there are 2 themes that I really focused on: God's presence and God's pleasure. In the beginning, I focused on God's presence and tried to remind myself as God speaks to me, I am here always. But on top of that, I leaned into God's pleasure. And I realized that focusing on God's pleasure is uniquely Christian. Because you see, Muslims, Jews, Hindus could all agree with God's presence. Yes, God is with me. Allah is with me. The nature, the world is with me. But God's pleasure is Christian. You see, because of the gospel, as Pastor Lewis explained, because of what Jesus has done for us, as Christians, we can confidently testify that God is pleased with me, that God delights in me. Irregardless of our behavior, our performance, our track record, God loves me. Jesus loves me, this I know. And so I spent some time meditating on God's pleasure over me. And I found that to be most startling in times when I felt most disappointing to the Lord. And yet to see God say, Jeff, my love has not changed. I still love you, was very rich and rewarding. Now, in addition to helping me unwind my identity from ministry, God revealed what a mess I am by helping me understand and uncover some childhood shame. This past summer, my family and I had the opportunity to visit Korea. And it was the first time I went to Korea since 1985. So it's been a long time. And I asked myself, why has it been so long? The reality is because I never had a desire to visit Korea, even though that's where my parents are from. I had no interest whatsoever. I didn't understand why until I went. You see, one day we visited Gyeongbokgung Palace. And for those of you who are fluent in Korean, my apologies. It's a historic palace built in the 14th century. And it was there where my mind was blown. Because you see, there were a lot of tourists there, a lot of foreigners dressed in what Koreans call hanboks, which is traditional Korean clothes. It's really flowery, bright pastel colors. If we can put up a picture, slide 1. You can see an example of these dress. So men and women, black people, brown people, white people, were all wearing these hanboks, taking selfies in the hot sun and high humidity. What was going on? Well, apparently these tourists were renting these hanboks, and my guess is they were reliving their favorite K-dramas. You see, there are a lot of K-dramas that are historical pieces. It's kind of like cosplay, right? They were dressing up, pretending that they were Korean, and this blew my mind. Why? You see, growing up, I hated hanboks. Every New Year, my mom would say, Jeffrey, you want to wear this? And I would protest. Why? Because they looked funny. Because they looked weird. Because they looked very un-American. You see, for my childhood, I grew up in a city that was 95% white. I was one of 2 Asians in my entire grade. And it was then that I realized that I had an unconscious longing to look like everyone else and an unconscious loathing that I was Korean. And so when my mom said, do you want to dress up in a hanbok? No way. Because it represents the very thing I'm ashamed of. And so if I grew up with that type of unconscious shame, you could see why it was so disorienting for me to see blonde, blue-eyed Americans dressed up in hanboks, becoming the very thing that I detested. And just as much as God was revealing this unconscious shame I had over my ethnic identity, He was also helping me grow in deep appreciation and admiration for the Korean people, their culture, their food, their people. we had an opportunity to visit the DMZ. Next slide. And there I was just acquainted with the traumatic event the Korean War had upon the Korean people. To be ripped apart from your spouse, your kids, your siblings, your parents. These ribbons represent the prayers of a family. And when the wind blows, they blow towards North Korea. And they represent a family's longing to see their loved one again. We also had an opportunity to visit the Korean Independent Museum, which narrated what life was like for Korea under occupation in the early 19th century or early 20th century. As a U.S. history major, I learned a lot about the oppression towards the Irish Americans, towards African Americans, towards the Japanese Americans. This was my first time really seeing and being exposed to the oppression of the Koreans by the Japanese in the early 20th century. And my heart broke. At the same time, as tourists, my wife and I are going around asking people for help, directions, questions, and we were so touched and amazed by the great generosity and kindness of strangers shown towards us. And the embracing of my Korean American identity would become all the more cemented through my exploration of my great-great-great-granduncle, Sejepil, otherwise known as Philip Jason. For those of you who don't know, Sejepil is one of the founding fathers of Korea's republic. He would be on the Mount Rushmore of Korea's independence. And so throughout Korea, we visited various monuments and museums dedicated to his honor. For example, here's a picture of a statue of him found in Independence Park, found in Seoul. Next slide is a picture of the Independence Arch, which he built and commissioned, which also stands at the Independence Park. The significance of this arch, which was built in 1895, is that prior to this arch, there was another gate that was built for foreign countries. It was known as the Welcome Gate. And it was Korea's way of saying, we welcome you to our country. Unfortunately, for centuries, Korea was living under occupation by various foreign territories. And so Sejepil had that raised, and with the approval of the king at the time, built the Independence Arch, patterned after the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, as a way of telling the world, we are our own sovereign nation. Now, Philip Jason was not only a famous Korean, but also he happens to be a very famous American. In fact, he's the first Korean American in U.S. history, becoming an American citizen in 1890. As a U.S. citizen, Philip Jason championed the cause for an independent Korea. He advised multiple presidents of America of what's going on in Korea, so that the American government would apply pressure to the foreign countries to support a democratic Korea. He also happened to marry the niece of President James Buchanan and leveraged his position in that family to support the cause of Korea. My family and I had the opportunity to visit his home in Pennsylvania, which is now a museum. And we also visited a statue of him in Washington, D.C., as seen here. Next slide. I was told that there are only 2 statues of Asians in Washington, D.C. One is of Philip Jason, and the other is of Gandhi. And so that's how prestigious a figure he is in American history. Now, how did following his footsteps help me? Well, 2 things stick out for me. One, Philip Jason reminds me of how all of us are called to live for something greater than ourselves. This was a man who sacrificed much for the greater good of his countrymen. As those of us who live in Orange County, the temptation for all of us, including myself, is to live for our own comfort, our own ease, leisure, and families. But God calls us to live for a greater vision, a greater purpose, and so that challenged me. The other thing that I gained from studying him was to see a man utilize his bicultural identity as both a Korean and American for the greater good. He helped me to see that my Korean-American identity is not a liability. It's not something I should be ashamed of, but something to be embraced and that actually can be leveraged for the greater good. And as I look out into this room, I see a lot of hyphenated identities. I see how that puts us in a unique position to make an impact on the kingdom of God, especially as this country becomes more and more diverse. Now, as much as I learned about myself, there was another great theme that the Lord helped me to really confront. I learned a lot about him. He became really big to me. Specifically, I learned that God is oh so trustworthy and oh so wise. You see, something interesting happened before we left for Korea. We were scheduled to leave on a Sunday, June 26th to be exact. At the time, Korea required everyone to have a negative COVID test before they left, before you get on the plane. Well, can you guess what happened? The day before, we all go to get tested, and I'm feeling a sore throat. And I'm like, oh no. I alone tested positive of my family. We were devastated. We were panicking. I was thinking, what do we do? Do we reschedule? Do we postpone to the winter? Do we go in August? Do we go next summer? But all those avenues just didn't work out. And we realized what was best was for us to send the family and me to join my family as soon as I test negative. I must say that those few days, that week I was home, was miserable. I was filled with so much guilt. And the reason is because that positive test was due to poor decision I made in going to a conference with thousands of people the week before. And so I was filled with guilt, saying, I just ruined our vacation. I just ruined this trip that my family were so excited to go on. And yet it was in that time of self-loathing and groveling that God said, really? Jeff, I'm trying to teach you something. You see, God helped me to realize that behind my guilt and loathing was a narrative, a false narrative that was playing in my head. It was the belief that my family needed me to enjoy Korea. That I was indispensable to their enjoyment of Korea. It was a very ungodly belief. And God was rebuking me and saying, Jeff, your family doesn't need you. Do you trust me with your family? And you see, this was a very common question, because at the beginning of my sabbatical, the God was saying the same thing, except he was saying, do you trust me with your church? Do you trust that your church can grow and thrive without you? And I slowly said, yes, Lord, I trust you. But now God was doing something different. Do you trust me with your family? That was harder. And God showed me that I could. In fact, when you ask one of my kids, What was your favorite part of Korea? He starts describing things he did during the first week. When I remember after he rattled off a few things, I'm like, wait, that's not when I was there. He's like, oh yeah. And God showed me, my family, I'm not indispensable even to my family. God is Lord of all. He is their ultimate shepherd. Now, learning to trust God would not end there. In August, I planned a week-long trip to Banff in Canada with my college friends. Now, I may not have been that excited to go to Korea, as I explained, but I was really excited about Banff. I remember the week leading up to it, telling my buddies who are all working and have families, I've got the most time, I'll plan the itinerary. And so I'm doing research into the hours of the night, planning out different hikes here and there. Super excited. Can you guess what happened? We were scheduled to leave on Monday. On Sunday, the day before, I go out to play soccer. What I do every Sunday afternoon for the last 25 years, seemingly. In the first 10 minutes of the game, I feel something in my knee. And I'm like, oh, that doesn't feel good. I think I'm going to walk off the field because I've got a big trip tomorrow. So I walk off the field and I play it conservative. 15 minutes later, I go to my car and I can't put weight on my knee. I'm hobbling to the car and I'm sweating. Oh my, what is going on? By the time I get home, I can't even limp. I have to get the crutches, thankfully that were in the garage, and I'm using crutches, going up and down the stairs, going throughout the house. I'm texting my friends, I don't think I can go. I'm angry. I can't believe this is happening again. And I'm upset with God, really upset. And I remember my wife, Helen, great words of wisdom. Jeff, you know it's not just able-bodied people who enjoy Banff. There are plenty of elderly, disabled people who go. And I'm like, oh yeah, right? And so I'm like, okay, I'll just make the most of it. I'm still kind of grumbling. I'm Googling Banff for disabled people. Generate a list. And, that's what happened. The next day, in the morning, call an Uber. I'm waiting outside my home on my crutches with my suitcase. I'm thinking to myself, boy, I hope the Uber driver, when he comes, will put my luggage in the trunk. Right? That's how helpless I was. SUV pulls up, and no one gets out of the car. I'm like, all right, that's fine. So I'm like pushing the suitcase ahead of me and then going like this, pushing it and going like this. I load into the car. I get into the back seat. I'm a little bit complaining, or maybe a lot. And then we're driving off, and the driver apologizes. He says, I'm so sorry I couldn't get your luggage, but as you can see, I'm disabled. And I look forward, and he's paraplegic. No use with his legs. He has his car outfitted so he can drive with a joystick with his hand. And there's a wheelchair in the passenger seat. And I'm like, wow, tell me your story. And he begins to explain how he grew up in Iran, and he was an electrical engineer doing an inspection of a building, and he fell 20 feet and severed his spine 10 years before. And he came to America because there's more help for people who are disabled like him. And he's just telling me his fight and his story. Talk about a perspective change for me. And the Lord was ministering to me. What are the chances? That's not coincidence. That was planned. And so when I was at the airport, I'm in a wheelchair being wheeled around. God was helping me to understand, to see what it's like to live through the eyes of millions of people who live disabled. and God softened my heart. But then in Calgary, when we landed, I was reminded of why God allowed this to happen. When I met with my friends, we all got there. First thing I do is I'm apologizing. I'm so sorry, guys. I'm so stupid. I shouldn't have played soccer. I don't want to hold you guys back. Go enjoy Banff. I've got my own itinerary. Don't worry about me. And one of my friends, and if we could show a slide of my friends, one of my friends, Jason, was like, Jeff, yeah, Banff is beautiful, and the hikes are great, but the reason why I took time off was so that we can hang out together. And during that trip, my friends were so attentive to my needs, opening doors, getting my food. One brother did my laundry and folded my clothes. I'm like, dude, you didn't have to fold my boxers, you know? And I think God was just saying, hey, enjoy the beauty of friendship. You've got some good friends here. And so I had specific plans, but God had a better plan, a more humbling plan, and yet a better plan. And I want to share more next Sunday as I unpack more about my sabbatical. Last but not least, the best part of my sabbatical was it allowed me to spend a lot of time with my family. A lot of time hanging out with them, doing nothing or doing special stuff. As many of you know, my oldest went off to college. And so being able to spend time with her before she left was gold, was absolutely precious. Spending time with my boys, I feel closer to them. The time gave me and Helen the space to really lean into our marriage and do some work on our marriage. I'm really thankful. One thing I really enjoyed was going to church with Helen, being able to worship with her and listen to sermons with her. It reminded me of what life was like before I became a pastor. And so for all of these reasons, I want to thank you, church, for letting me leave and being so gracious. Whenever I tell my pastor friends about the sabbatical, one question that tends to come up is, did anyone complain? And I'm like, complain? And they're like, oh yeah, when I went on sabbatical, people complained. And I'm like, no, they were so, maybe some of you were complaining internally, but I didn't hear anything. And so I really appreciate your generosity, the texts, the cards you sent me, even during the sabbatical, saying that you're praying for me. It was such a joy. I want to thank the elders for giving me and my family this gift, for thinking of our spiritual well-being. Thank you. I want to thank Rick, Mike, and Luan, and Helen for being helping me craft a proposal that was accepted by the Lilly Foundation that financed my sabbatical. And last but not least, I don't think anyone was more impacted by my sabbatical than Pastor Lewis. I'll give him a hand. Thank you for holding down the fort so competently, so faithfully. It made it easy for me to step away, to know that you and the elders were there caring for the people. And I know there were many moments where you probably wanted to call me and be like, what the heck? Why did you leave this summer? Do you know what's going on? But whenever I touched base with you, and it was always me calling you, you not calling me, you just took everything so in stride, doing your best to preserve and protect my sabbatical, and I really appreciate that. And here's a little gift as an expression of our church's thanksgiving for you. Yeah.